Hi, Devi. Welcome to Network Capital. Our mission is to democratize mentorship and make quality career guidance accessible to everyone. We love hosting people who've built their category of one, and you're definitely one of those. Um, could you tell us a bit about yourself and what do you do today?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Devi Lockwood, and I'm the author of this book, which is called 1001 Voices on Climate Change. It just came out in August with Simon Schuster. And to do the research for this, I spent about 5 years traveling in 20 countries on 6 continents on a mission to document 1001 human stories about water and climate change. And this is the story of those stories. And I now work as a journalist. My day job is as the ideas editor for a nonprofit newsroom called Rest of World, and we cover the impact of technology outside of the West. But in the evenings, I continue to do this kind of climate-related storytelling that started with this project in the book.
Fascinating. I remember meeting you 4 years back in Denmark, and then you were doing research for this book, and I thought that the way you went about it was fascinating. So long journey, congratulations. It's a delight to see your book finally out. Tell us about your writing process. How did you get interested in writing the written word for the first time?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I've always been kind of interested in storytelling and started out really falling in love with poetry. I remember reading a poem by a writer named Valerie Worth about zinnias, the flower, when I was a kid. And it just was such an impactful and beautiful piece of writing. And so I started writing on my own after that and studied folklore and mythology for my undergraduate degree, which let me take a bunch of creative writing classes on the side, but also at the same time, I was learning about global traditions of storytelling and different ways that people communicate stories and through that identity and belonging around the world. And my senior year, I did this bike trip the summer before senior year down 800 miles of the Mississippi River. And along the way, I recorded stories from people I met and ended up writing poems that were inspired by those people's stories for my thesis. And it was a lot of fun. I loved the interviewing, but the writing, transforming that into poetry didn't feel quite right. But I knew that I wanted to continue doing a similar kind of storytelling work, and was fortunate to get a grant that let me continue doing it, and kind of fell sideways into nonfiction writing and journalism centered around environmental issues after that.
Yeah, one question we always try to answer on Network Capital is how people discover their passion. So
Mm.
in your case, it seems like it was experimentative, and in college, I think you went to Harvard. You traveled around, and what did you learn about yourself, and how did you fall in love with the environment, so to speak?
Yeah. So on that first bike trip down the Mississippi, I was wearing a cardboard sign that just said open call for stories. So I was open to any story that people wanted to share with me. And the farther down the river I was riding my bike, the more stories I was hearing specifically about water and climate change in terms of intensifying storms and saltwater encroachment on the land. And in some cases, people making a decision to leave a community that they had called home from generations in the aftermath of a big storm. And I thought that it would be impactful to put those stories in dialogue with stories from other parts of the world. But also, I found those stories to be really sticky. I couldn't stop thinking about them. And for that reason, it seemed to me like there was a bit of a gap in terms of how people were discussing and understanding issues like climate change in the general public, and how climate scientists were working around those issues and discussing them. And it seemed like there was a communication gap between the two that I could help to try to fill through interviews and also different techniques of writing like metaphor. And so it seemed like it would be a good use of my time and skills to try to help bridge that gap with stories.
And what was that disconnect that you discovered? I think it's part of your book as well, that disconnect. And I think you've done a phenomenal job of documenting it, but it'll be great to
Yeah.
explore the origins.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I mean, so climate change is often communicated in very abstract and numerical terms. We can talk about degrees of temperature change or millimeters of sea level rise. And it's really hard to understand what that feels like or how that impacts people and their lives. And so what I wanted to do was in this book to interview people who are experiencing the impacts of climate change firsthand, and then to make those impacts easier to understand in a kind of textured and embodied way.
Yeah. And you've written about some of them in the New York Times, now at the rest of the world as well. Tell us about, you decided to study right after Harvard again, right? To get another degree.
Yeah, it wasn't right after. There were a couple years of travel in between, but I completed in 2019 a master's degree in science journalism at MIT. And that was really just wanting to lead myself in the direction of a staff writing job. And I had found that in the course of the journey, I had interviewed a handful of climate scientists who were doing some really interesting work. And it was exactly that translation gap that I mentioned before, where we need more in the way of science communication and distilling these complex subjects for a general interest audience. And that seemed like something I wanted to continue to do in a more concentrated way, and that pursuing this degree would allow me to do exactly that.
And you did. You landed up a phenomenal dream job, people would say, as a fellow at the New York Times, right?
Yeah, it was fantastic. I worked for a year during this fellowship in the opinion section and edited opinion essays, and was able to bring in contributors from all over. And that was a really great experience.
I read all your essays, and I read generally anything you write. But there was one essay that really struck me, where you traveled and met this woman. And tell us about the art of collecting the story, and how did that story come to life?
Sure. Sorry, could you give me just a few more clues about which essay that was?
Yeah, you'd gone to meet this woman who I think had lost someone, or was reminiscing on a story of the past. And you were talking about, that entire piece was about that reflection.
Oh, sure. Was it about my friendship with
Yes.
like intergenerational friendships? Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. So happy to talk about that. So the woman, her name is Cora Brooks. She's passed away, but in the last couple of years of her life, I was really fortunate to travel and meet with her a couple of times. I was living in Boston at the time, and she was living up here in Vermont. And Cora and I connected because her papers are archived at Harvard in the Schlesinger Library on the history of women in America. And I, as an undergraduate, applied for a research grant where I proposed to do a project where I was looking at the work of female poets who had their papers archived at the Schlesinger. And I started alphabetically by last name with this woman named Cora Brooks, and never got to anyone else because her papers were so interesting and I didn't want to stop reading them. And she not only was a poet, but had started a hotline for women who were experiencing domestic violence and needed a safe place to stay in rural Vermont. She was also really active as a protester against various wars, and also against nuclear power in Vermont. And I just loved reading her stories and her diaries and her letters. And I realized after a couple of months that she was still alive and that her address was in the papers. And I figured if she was older, she probably hadn't moved in the last couple of years. So I wrote her a letter and asked if she might come to Harvard to visit. And she said, no, I'm much too old to come. But she wrote back right away and said, you should come and visit me. And it was just such a beautiful experience. I traveled up that winter and stayed with her for a couple of days. And she taught me how to make bread, and we would watercolor paint postcards and just share stories and cook together. And we became friends, and that friendship lasted for several years until she passed away. But I wrote an essay for Sunday Review in the New York Times opinion section kind of talking about the importance of intergenerational friendships and what that friendship meant to me at that point in my life, in my early 20s. And yeah, I continue to be grateful for what that friendship gave me.
Interestingly, even in my book, there's a chapter on intergenerational leadership, which is why I read it with a different lens. I had talked about how companies of today really need to have people across age groups, both young and old, so that people can learn from each other. And you've taken a much more poetic sense, a sense of capturing that story. So many of our readers are really interested in how stories come together. What does the art and craft and rigor of writing look like? You obviously studied, documented this for a while. Could you, through the story, just walk us through what were some of the most exciting parts and challenging parts of putting this together? How did you structure it, edit it, how much time it took?
Yeah, well, so the interviews themselves I started doing in 2013. So it was around 5 years of documenting and recording material, both in audio, and I kept a blog along the way. I wrote a whole bunch of social media posts and revisited all of that material when I was working on the draft. So I wrote it mostly during the pandemic year and mostly at night because I have a day job. So it's pretty unglamorous, right? I was writing from 8 p.m. until I fell asleep at my laptop. I used a program called Scrivener, which I would recommend to anyone who's working on a long form writing project. What's great about Scrivener is that it's pretty cheap. It's around, I think, $50 US. Don't quote me on that, but you can use it offline, which is great for signing out. And it's kind of like digital note cards. So you can write different sections of a bigger project, but then also rearrange those sections in different orders. So I find if I'm working on just one big Google Doc or Word document, you have to scroll for 8 years before you finally get down to the section you're working on. And it can also feel really overwhelming working on what feels like the whole thing at once. So Scrivener is fantastic because you can just work on one little piece at a time. And in terms of the organization, I struggled a little bit with this because I thought at first maybe it would make the most sense to organize the book chronologically. But there were parts of the journey where I traveled in a bit of a zigzag pattern, and I thought that might be a little bit incoherent. So I decided to organize it loosely chronologically, but primarily by geography. Each chapter is a different country, and those are loosely organized into regions and geographic areas, which means that sometimes it jumps around a bit in time. But I wanted to maintain kind of geography as the core organizing principle. And then I found it just to be very helpful because I, had one big deadline, but I set that big deadline into many smaller deadlines and did my best to maintain those. And that I found to be very helpful for, again, breaking down this larger project into many smaller pieces that felt achievable over time.
Yeah. Organizing something like as complex is challenging, right? And maintaining a deadline, having a day job, all of this, it requires really strict discipline of writing and your overall schedule. Tell us about your travels and how did you research for these chapters? What were some of the most exciting parts of curating this or writing all of it?
Yeah, so the travel itself happened, about half of it was by bicycle and half of it was not. And sometimes I would just have a general direction that I knew I wanted to go in, but a lot of it was just figuring things out on the go. I had a little bit of a plan, but not too much of a plan. So that allowed, I think, for more in the way of spontaneity and being able to say yes to things that I might not have said yes to otherwise. And yeah, I traveled with this cardboard sign. It said, "Tell me a story about water" on one side and "Tell me a story about climate change" on the other. And I would wear that when I was just kind of walking around different places, and people would approach me and either offer to tell me a story or suggest someone who had a great story that they knew of who I should speak with. And I found that just around the world, people were very generous in sharing those stories and in kind of, yeah, just being willing to communicate in that way.
What about language and or cultural barriers? Did you face any? What were some challenges that people embarking upon such a mission should expect?
Sure. Yeah. So at first, I didn't want to go anywhere where English wasn't the primary language because I was worried about exactly that. But uh, some of the zigzag flow of the journey led me to Thailand. And so I had a friend of a friend help me translate the cardboard sign into Thai, and also was able to have kind of a couple of paragraphs translated introducing who I was, what I was doing, why I was doing it, would someone like to share a story? And that combined with a lot of body language was in some cases enough to get people's consent to turn the audio recorder on. And so for some of those stories, I didn't know what they said until I came back home and had them translated. And it was a very exciting experience to figure that out, in some cases a couple years down the line. But yeah, in some countries I worked with a translator briefly in China, and then also in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan I traveled with people who were able to help me out with kind of simultaneous translation. But again, in some cases it was not until years later. And I do speak Spanish, so that was helpful in
Right.
some contexts. Yeah.
Traveling by bike sounds super exciting and super environmentally friendly. What was it really like? What did it feel? Did people stop you on the way and saying that, hey, this is intriguing, this is interesting? What were the initial reactions like? Did you expect that you would get that kind of reaction?
Yeah, I mean, I love traveling by bicycle. I think, especially traveling solo by bike, it's a very social way of traveling because you meet so many people and people are always curious about what you're doing and why you're doing it. Um, I found that the other great thing about being on the bike is that other forms of transportation lead you to hubs that are often urban places, but the bicycle, by necessity, you're kind of in the places between places and speaking with people who might not otherwise have the microphone, right? So for this project in particular, given that climate change is a global issue with such highly localized impacts, I found that it was really great to be on the bike because I was able to have conversations that I wouldn't be able to have if I was only traveling in cities or using other forms of transportation. And the other great thing, just personally, is because so much of the documenting this audio was so intensely personal, I was able to have this time by myself on the bike to sort of think through all of the stories that I had just heard. And sometimes I would pause and pull over and just like scribble something down because I couldn't get it out of my head. But having that alone time with myself, I found to be a really great counterpoint to recording the stories themselves.
Devi, how did you pick pick the countries where you collected these stories, the places?
So when I was first designing the early stages of this trip and applying to grants, I was doing homework sitting across the table from a friend of mine who is taking a politics of immigration course. And she introduced me to and kind of tossed an article my way about Tuvalu, which is a coral atoll nation in the Pacific, and the idea of climate refugees or people from Tuvalu having a special visa relationship set up with New Zealand such that it's relatively easy for people to apply for a lottery and migrate. And I was like, oh, cool. I don't even know where Tuvalu is. So I looked it up on the map and decided that that was one of the first places I wanted to go. And then zooming out a bit, all the flights to Tuvalu went through Fiji. So I figured, when else in my life am I going to have the opportunity to go to Fiji for a couple of months? So added that to the map. And then New Zealand was right there. And I had heard that New Zealand was a great place to ride bikes. So, and then beyond that, my original plan after I had visited those countries was to go to the UK and then back home, and that would be a year. And what happened was when I got on my bicycle in New Zealand, I felt within myself this deep urge to slow down and wanted to really take my time rather than rush through it. And I decided to crowdfund the money to take a cargo ship to Australia. And spent about 6 months cycling up the east coast of Australia, and then hitched a ride on 2 sailboats and ended up back in New Zealand, even though that wasn't my intention. And then continued to try to get a boat going anywhere that wasn't Australia, but it didn't work out. So then I bought a cheap flight to Bangkok, and then was in Thailand and Laos and Cambodia on the bicycle. And then it turned into rainy season, and I went back home for several months, and then started doing legs of the journey that were possible to do without the bike, or easier to do without the bike. So it was kind of chaotic, but with a little bit of planning, just the right amount of planning, I think I was able to make the most of the experience.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I have so many questions on this, but I have to tell you a small story. Do you know our website, networkcapital.tv? So
.tv,
.tv is also what people think of when they think of Tuvalu, the country. And once I was speaking to somebody, and he said that, how did he choose Tuvalu as your URL? And I said, oh, did I? I thought that I'd chosen .tv as in like Twitch TV, Network Capital TV, Netflix TV, etc., etc. But it turns out that it was a country. So maybe our stories were intersecting.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting that Tuvalu got assigned that domain name, and now a significant portion of the GDP of the country is related to sales from that, which gets leased out, I think, about every 10 years. To a company that then resells the domain name suffix to different people. So it's interesting for sure.
It surprised me when I stumbled on this. But just sticking on this journey, when you're embarking upon, say, the adventure of your life, having some sort of a plan, but not everything figured out, what was the reaction of your friends and family? Were they thrilled? Were they nervous? Somewhere in between?
Gosh, well, you have to ask them directly, but I think they were super supportive. I had kind of a strange upbringing in that I was raised by mountaineers, and my mom, when I was very young, was a single mom, and she also climbed in the Himalayas, and I would live with my grandparents during that time. So I think that adventuring was something that was very normal to me. Some of my earliest baby pictures are of like me winter camping while my parents were climbing. So I think that, I grew up sleeping outside in a tent and being okay with the idea of a woman going off and doing an adventure on her own just because she wanted to. So that in some ways was really great. I mean, I'm super grateful for that upbringing because it never felt like an obstacle, right? It supported me. My family was super supportive and in this journey, and I'm so grateful for that.
Yeah, we're all grateful, all the readers that you have, friends around the world, because it's so important for young leaders, writers to travel around the world. It's so difficult to document authentically about places you haven't really built a rapport with. And I think through your book, through all your writings, you do that. You travel, you experience, internalize, and then write about it. I think that makes so much of a difference.
Thank you.
Devi, if you were to talk to me about some of your mentors that you had in college and after, who shaped your writing, shaped your thinking, who would they be, and how they sort of played a role in your life?
Sure. So one big one is Deborah Foster. She was the head of the Folklore Mythology program at Harvard. And I think one of the main things that made Deborah such an incredible leader and mentor is that she really prioritized listening in our conversations with students. And I didn't realize how rare that was until I was in a different context where that wasn't so much the case. But she came at every conversation with a kind of, how can we make this work? And what's best for you? And what is it that you need, right? So I had a lot of academic freedom as an undergrad, was able to devise this kind of creative thesis that ultimately led into this book. So obviously served me really well. And yeah, her guidance was like kind of gentle and light, but very, very supportive. And I think she's just a stunning example of what a mentor in that kind of context can be and can do for someone. And I know that many of my peers similarly benefited from that openness that she brought to her position. And Yeah, my thesis advisor was this poetry professor named Josh Bell, who similarly, he just gave me great books to read. And I think that is a really important function of a mentor early on too, is to point, especially for writers in the direction of things that they might not have considered before, or folks who are writers that are wrestling with similar themes, but in a different way. And so that was a fantastic experience. And then interestingly, I got a lot of mentorship through a Facebook group of women and gender non-binary writers that started around 2014. And that group taught me how to pitch, and passed along editor contacts and mentored me in just the right way when I needed it, that got my career in freelance writing started off. And yeah, it was one of those things that was just kind of built over time. And that's something now that, given that my day job is mostly editing, I try to do as an editor is prioritize mentoring younger writers who are earlier on in their career, because I think it's just, it was something I want to pay forward. I'm so grateful for that help and that support that group was able to give me when I needed it, when I was getting started.
Yeah, it's so important, right? Sometimes the right connection, a nudge in the right direction, great books, listening carefully, they can make the world of difference between, a good career and one that's seems like a rocket ship. Devi, tell me about the editing process. I would imagine you would have to leave out some stories or cut out some sections of the book. What was it like?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely overwrote the first draft. And so I worked with a couple of different editors at Simon & Schuster who were able to help me trim it a little bit. And then I also had a kind of group of friends who read drafts and were very generous in offering feedback. And one thing I wish I had done more of, which is interesting now that I'm doing some readings of the book for different events, is I wish I had done more reading the book out loud earlier on in the editing process, because I think that would have helped me edit. I'm finding myself even still now making small changes. And I don't know if that was your experience too. It's very hard to have the book exist in such concrete form, because I'm like, oh, is it done? I think it's done, but there's always things that could be different. And so I think part of that is just surrendering to the fact that it's done, and needing to let go and move on to the next thing, and wrap up all of the lessons that I learned in writing this first book and just bring it on to the next one, right? But it's sometimes hard to hard to let go.
Yeah, the first book is so special, just holding it in your hands and getting the first set of copies, one never really forgets that. I do believe in the power of actually speaking out. I tried that also after writing my book, when I was doing some readings like you, because when you speak out the word, sometimes you realize, oh, there's a missing link. Oh, this word could have been different. And you realize so many changes. So maybe in the next one that I'm working on, I'll try and do that more intentionally.
Yeah, I wonder if every writer feels that way. It's like, oh, it's never quite done, but
I know you write poetry as well, and I think especially for poetry, it might be interesting to try out more actively.
It's interesting. I don't do it very consciously, but I find that sometimes I write the poem version of something before I write the full written out version of it, and it's sort of this like skeletal architecture that helps me get from point to point to point to point where I need to go. It's almost like an outline, but more rhythmic than that. But I highly recommend it. I mean, reading poetry is always super nourishing, I find too.
It's fascinating what you just said, the skeleton process. Usually people put down points or have a rough draft, but using poetry as a skeleton could be interesting to try. I'm going to try out.
It's worth a try. It's fun, I find.
What was the ultimate goal of writing this book? What did you want the reader to experience, a takeaway? How did you want him or her to or them to change the way they look at the subject?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I wrote this book for people who might feel alienated by the conversation about climate change as it is, or a little bit overwhelmed. My goal was to really humanize the issue and to bring first-person stories into the mix, to diversify the way that we talk about climate change and to just make it more accessible for people to understand both the impacts and the solutions that people are experiencing and working on all around the world.
Yeah. And I think towards that goal, you've definitely succeeded, and the first of many books to come. Did you encounter people who strongly disagreed with you? Because climate is a fairly polarizing issue, unfortunately. People have.
Yes, I did.
And,
Yeah, I did.
and
It was interesting. I met a couple in New Zealand who are what we might call like kind of hardcore climate deniers, and they don't trust the science. They believe that someone is out to profit from this kind of conversation. And when I asked them more questions about that, they told me that whenever they watched a news segment about climate change on their local news station, they saw the same clip of ice falling into the water over and over again. And for them, that just made it completely unbelievable. And I think it got down to a kind of lack and gap, both in science communication in terms of what that news station was doing, but in terms of science education as well. And I think that if we can communicate these issues in a more accessible way and also have stronger science education such that people are able to access these issues, that will only help.
And did you struggle to have these conversations, or did you expect these objections or sort of challenges on the climate science to come your way?
I just found them really interesting, to be honest. I tried to approach every conversation in this book and just conversations in life in general with the attitude that everyone has something to teach me if only I make time for it. And for that reason, I was very interested in listening to people whose perspectives and points of view were different than my own.
Have you always been a good listener, or did you become a better listener through the course of writing this book?
I definitely got better at it. I listened to some of those early interviews from when I was riding my bike down the Mississippi River and honestly cringed a little bit because I wasn't really fully listening. I was always thinking about the next question that I was going to ask, or I was interjecting into silences, maybe when someone was just thinking, and listening just really with only the intention to respond. And I found that wasn't listening, that was talking. And in fact, that the conversations and interviews and stories got much better when I took the time to slow down and ask some prompting questions, yes, but be fully present in a way. And that method of deep listening is something that I was not very good at, but I like to think that I got much better at over the course of doing the 1,001 interviews for this book.
Yeah. Any technique or tips for people who struggle with deep listening?
I would say to remove distractions. Like nod, lean forward a little bit, just fall forward into the rhythm of someone else's voice, right? Pay attention to what they're saying, and then to not be afraid of, awkward silences. Sometimes silence is just people thinking.
Yeah, that was my biggest takeaway from what you just said. So Devi, when you look at this book, you talked about slowing down a couple of times during this discussion. How did slowing down make your book and writing the experience better?
Sure. I think before I did this project, I had lived in a way that by necessity was just very efficient. And I knew how to get things done quickly. And that had served me very well up until that point. And suddenly I was just, answering more or less only to myself and my own design for this project, and not in school. And it wasn't like there was a map saying how I had to go and what I had to do and what the steps were to, be successful in doing this, right? I was defining it on my own terms. And that was really the first time in my life that I had done that. And not only was I listening to other people, perhaps for the first time in a really deep way, but I was also, having so much time to listen to myself very deeply. And when I did that, I encountered just this desire to slow down. And I think that there's spaces and times in which slowness is important, and spaces and times in which it's better to move quickly, but learning to distinguish those two and then to act is one kind of unintentional gift, I would say, that this journey gave me.
Would you call the past year and a half slowing down or moving at an accelerated pace for yourself?
Well, I mean, the pandemic, obviously, it hasn't been a voluntary slowing down, but it definitely feels like a slowing down. I mean, I spent so much of that first year writing and editing, but in a way, yeah, it was definitely a slow kind of moving through molasses feeling, and that all the days blended together.
Is there something called a writer's block? Have you encountered that? What does this term mean to you?
Yeah, it's right. Writer's block is interesting, right? I think that often it can be motivated by like fear or just like a desire to overthink things. But I've found that breaking down a big project into little tiny pieces and always knowing where I was going to go next, and just developing the muscle of sitting down at the same time every day for a couple of hours to work on a project made that inaction kind of disappear, because I knew that was the time when I just needed to get things done.
So you believe in deep work. So when you write, no distractions, cell phone away. Is that your writing
Ideally,
practice?
yeah. And for parts of it where I really was struggling with that, I would do the like Pomodoro timer, especially with edits, because I found that was useful just for really structuring the time when it would be too easy to fall into distractions if I wanted to.
And just if you just look at your book, the reception that you're getting from the people whose stories you've told, the kind of places whose stories you've told, what are they saying? What was one compliment or critique that spoke most vividly to you?
Yeah, it's been really wonderful. I heard back from a woman in Australia who I had interviewed some members of her family and also stayed with them for a handful of days. And she sent a picture on Facebook of herself reading the story in which her family members were quoted. And it was just so beautiful to see that, how much she enjoyed it and how it felt really like I'd almost created a community in the process of connecting these stories together. So that felt really fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a community builder at heart. Network Capital is essentially a large global community. But I think what you've really done through this book is also create a community. Any plans of actually translating that into a digital or a physical hub and spoke kind of a model?
I mean, it's an interesting idea. It's not one that I've explored in depth, but definitely something I'll be thinking about moving forward. I think one of my main intentions was to create an archive kind of more for the future, getting back to that, linking up with the experience I had with Cora Brooks at the archive in Harvard. That was super meaningful to me. So, not only am I interested in the idea of this community existing now, but I'm also thinking about people of the future and hoping that they can access this work either in the written form or through the audio interviews, and understand a bit better how we were thinking about water, climate change, and the environment more generally in this 5-year period.
Yeah. So in the years to come, what are, like, say, 3 things that you would love to see differently when you think of water, the environment at large, the way we tell the stories about the environment?
Ooh, 3 things. Okay. Human-centered storytelling, specifically the voices of the people who are most impacted by these issues, to be front and center of how we discuss them. I would love for more people to engage, not so much with changing individual actions, but looking at systemic change, and specifically with fossil fuel infrastructure, and just engaging with different tactics of how to target that directly, so that it's ideally not even implemented in the first place, or that it can be taken offline or shut down. And then I also think that divestment is a huge and important strategy. Harvard recently divested from its portfolio of fossil fuels, but there's so much work to be done. And that was, a struggle that was probably 10 years in the making, right? And people thought it might never happen. But there's lots more work to do in terms of getting funds out of this industry that is so entrenched in many of our global systems. And that's where I think the twang point is, the ability to have an outsized impact that goes beyond just one people or a group of people to address the challenge in a more global way.
Yeah, fascinating. Have you changed your mind about something that you strongly believed in the past, say, couple of years writing this book, or engaging with these subjects, even if you were to look back in time?
I don't think I really had a good handle on the topic in a global way. And so it's less changing my mind than just having more of a nuanced understanding of it, and
Gotcha.
of the multiple impacts when it comes to, everything from food security and water security to migration, and what motivates people to leave places that they might call home. I think that my understanding has expanded to be able to better understand those nuances, and also to be able to make connections across disparate geographies to how these issues are interconnected and impacting people's lives in similar ways.
Yeah. Do you think your education, which was both say, mythology and say science writing, the combination really helps you get a good grasp of tricky subjects such as water, environment, and so forth? If yes, how?
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's prompted me to ask better questions, and to think about these issues in just a slightly different way, maybe, than other people.
Is there another book that you're working on or thinking about?
Noodling around with the beginnings of a fiction manuscript right now. We'll see what happens with that. It really needs more of my time and attention than I can give it at the moment. But yeah, I would love to continue doing this kind of reporting, both at home and abroad, when it becomes possible to do a bit more in the way of travel. But for right now, kind of content with talking with people about this book, and also just kind of making some space and time in my own imagination to travel to another place in that way. So we'll see. I can't say too much about it right now, but definitely writing one has given me the confidence that I would love to do another. And there's so much that I learned in the process of writing this book that I just want to apply to the next one. I'm sure you can relate to that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And Devi, just finally, for people who are aspiring to write a book or aspiring to getting published, what's one advice that has most helped you? What advice would you give to prospective writers?
Yeah, I would say read a lot.
Yeah.
Because your writing will only improve for it, and also you'll be able to better understand where the gaps are in the conversation, and how you can specifically put your own work into that gap to fill it. For me, I saw this gap in terms of how climate change is being discussed globally, and wanted to fill that with this project. But there's so many, books that need to be written, or stories that need to be told, that only you can tell. And so figure out, read widely, understand where those gaps are, and then think critically about how you can be the one to fill them.
Yeah. And just like closing out, suppose there was a huge billboard on the busiest street in Vermont or New York or Boston, wherever you call home, and you could leave a message for anybody to read and reflect on, your message to the world. What would it be?
Ooh, maybe take the time to listen. That we need to make more space and time for listening to each other in these busy lives that we lead, because it can lead to really beautiful and unexpected places.
Yeah. What a fascinating conversation, Devi. Thanks so much for your time. We're going to make sure that the link for your book is available so that people around the world can listen and enjoy and reflect on in this important subject. Thank you for writing this book, and thank you for being on Network Capital.